Welcome, everyone. I'm Oren Stier, Director of the Holocaust and Genocide Studies Program and Professor of Religious Studies at FIU. On behalf of Hillel at FIU, the Jewish Museum of Florida at FIU, and the Holocaust and Genocide Studies Program, it's my pleasure to welcome you to FIU's annual Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Week. Every year, we organize and present a diverse series of events during this week to educate the community and inspire thought, action, and greater civic engagement. Now, more than ever, this awareness is sorely needed. This evening's event is a special edition of the FIU South Beach Arts Outposts series on the Avenue. It highlights exhibitions and collection items honoring the memory of those lost to the Holocaust and the resilience of the Jewish community. It's co-sponsored by our three Washington Avenue institutions, the Wolfsonian FIU, Miami Beach Urban Studios, and the Jewish Museum of Florida FIU, and features presentations by Todd Bothel of the JMOF, Jon Mogul of the Wolf, and Michael Klotz of MBUS. Throughout today's presentations, members of the audience are encouraged to post questions to the Q&A box that I will pose to our panelists, time permitting. Our three presentations tonight work their way up the avenue, as it were, offering a salon-style sampling of what makes FIU's cultural annexes so compelling. They showcase a diverse range of Jewish artistic expression that highlights the variety of forms of creativity that emerged from the milieu of European Jewry. We begin in Poland with Todd's story of the unique and intricate architecture of Polish wooden synagogues, their long history, their widespread destruction during the Nazi era, and one man's efforts to recreate and thereby preserve in miniature just a few of those that were lost. We move then from Eastern European religious structures to Western European secular graphic arts, with Jon's presentation of the commercial designer Julius Klinger's posters, ad campaigns, typography, illustrations, and more. Here too, there is tragic loss, though I will leave it to Jon to share the details. Finally, we conclude our virtual gallery walk with Michael's own poignant reflections on his personal connection to the Holocaust, followed by his performance of Tefillah, a work by the Jewish refugee composer Julius Klinger, who arrived in America in 1938 after the Anschluss, Germany's incorporation of Austria into the Third Reich, which was largely welcomed by non-Jewish Austrians. Our three presentations tonight are linked together by a sense of loss, physical, cultural, spiritual. But at the same time, they speak to the endurance of identity, even despite destruction. Above all, they reflect on the nature and importance of cultural preservation, particularly in the face of upheaval, and the value of artistic transmission, reproduction, even recreation. And now, Todd Bothel.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to be talking about the wooden synagogues of Poland. Here we go. The Jews were invited to the Polish-Lithuanian region during the late 11th century by Prince Boleslaw III, who recognized their talents in developing culture and the economy. For nearly 400 years, the Jews in Poland prospered and received social autonomy and religious tolerance. By the mid-16th century, nearly 80% of the world's Jews lived in Poland, and this was the most prosperous period for Polish Jews. The period from 1580 to 1648 has been called the Golden Age of Jews in Poland. After the collapse of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1795, Jewish life was much harsher under Russian rule. By this time, a majority of the Jews were living in shtetls, which are small towns. It was in these small towns that the Jews built their synagogues. During the 16th and 17th centuries, the Jews developed an original style of architecture, the Wooden Synagogue. Approximately 1,000 were constructed across Poland. In many parts of the world, Jews were prevented from being in the building trades or practicing decorative painting and wood carving. In Poland, Jewish craftsmen were allowed, and they built and decorated these synagogues. The wooden synagogues were unique because they were built in a uniquely Jewish style, making them a truly original folk expression. According to art historian Stephen Kaiser, the wooden synagogues of Poland, with their painted and carved interiors, were truly an original and organic manifestation of artistic expression, the only real Jewish folk art in history. After the Germans invaded Poland in 1939, in addition to wiping out the Jewish population, either through the mass killings in the countryside or in the concentration camps, the Germans also tried to erase the presence of the Jewish Polish community by utilizing cemetery headstones as road building materials and burning the wooden synagogues to the ground. All right, why are we not playing? There we go. Following World War II, Maria and Kazimir Pichakov published a book, Wooden Synagogues, in 1957. During the war, they had fought as partisans as part of the resistance and had been students at the Warsaw University of Technology and Architecture. After the war, they worked on reconstruction of monuments before going into urban planning of small towns. As part of their job and a hobby, they researched wooden synagogue architecture, where they studied and documented and described the former wooden synagogues of Poland. This book was the first truly comprehensive survey of Jewish folk architecture and folk art. The map that you see on the right is where these wooden synagogues were located. The red ones highlighted were the ones that were included in the book. The first one I'm going to talk about is the synagogue that was in Gambin. It was built in 1710 and renovated in 1893. It was considered to be of great artistic merit, and it was actually admired by Napoleon when he made his trek to Russia. Between the world wars, it was declared a national monument. Unfortunately, it was burned down by the Nazis on Yom Kippur in 1939. And of the 2,100 Gambin Jews, only 210 survived the war. Piedzbor was built in 1760. The one you see in the center here is the third one that was constructed. The first one was built in 1594, which burned down. The second one was built in 1654, which was destroyed by a Russian pogrom. As you can see from the pictures, the walls are covered with paintings of flowers, animals, and monochrome text from the Torah. This one was also burned down by the Nazis in 1942. Gwoździak was built somewhere between 1635 and 1650. It exemplifies the high point in Jewish architectural art and religious painting. The wall paintings included prayers, inscriptions, decorative motifs, animals, vegetation, and the zodiac. And as you can see in the center picture, that's looking up into the cupola of the roof. This one was also destroyed by the Nazis in 1939. Luckily, when the Museum of History of Polish Jews in Warsaw opened, they built an 85% replica scale of this ceiling vault using traditional building skills as part of their core exhibition. Kornik was built in 1767. It was designed by famed Polish architect Hillel Benjamin, and it was burned down during World War II. Ludomayersк was also designed by Hillel Benjamin and was built between 1763 and 1765. It was one of the largest wooden synagogues ever built. In fact, as you can see in the center picture there, when Benjamin designed it, the roof structure actually extends beyond the walls of the building, which accounts for the columns that are placed on the outside. This one burned down in 1915. Pilica was built in 1690 and was destroyed by the Nazis in September of 1939. Zablodow was built in 1635. It is considered to be a Jewish cultural treasure and was one of the most beautiful wooden synagogues in all of Poland. In 1929, it was included on a list of registered historical monuments of Poland. Again, unfortunately, it was destroyed by the Germans in 1941. Although it was long thought that none of the wooden synagogues survived the destruction of the First and Second World Wars, it's now known that a number of them do survive, although most of them are the smaller scale buildings. Approximately 15 are known to survive, mostly in Lithuania. The pictures that you see here are two of them that have survived. The one on the left is Kirkliai, which was constructed just prior to the war in 1936. After the war, it was used as a storage house up until the 1990s. And then beginning in 2019, the city and the people around there started restoration of this building. The building on the right is Pakrias, which was built in 1801. It is the oldest surviving synagogue in Lithuania. After World War II, it was transformed into a movie house and later a sports hall. It was restored and reopened in 2017. And according to one of the websites I was researching, there's ongoing archaeological research because they are also trying to find the Winter Synagogue and the Shtibel, which is the Hasidic synagogue that were also part of this complex. All right, the picture that you see here is a man called Peter Maurice. He was an Englishman who was a pilot, but also was kind of an amateur artist, did some woodworking and did metal work. In the early 2000s, he was diagnosed with cancer, and his doctor gave him a book, or gave him the book that I mentioned at the beginning that showed the pictures of and the architectural perspectives. He then started constructing 1/40th scale models. He finished 10 of them before he unfortunately passed away. But prior to his passing, he made arrangements to have these 10 synagogues donated to the Jewish Museum. And in 2011, we opened an exhibit called the Wooden Synagogues of Poland, where we highlighted the 10 synagogues and the people that lived in Poland during the war or prior to the war. And this is what we basically came up with. It was one of our most popular exhibits that we've ever done. We still have people today that come into the building and want to see the models. So that concludes my portion of this. I'm going to now hand this off to Jon Mogul of the Wolfsonian FIU.
Thanks very much, Todd, and thanks everybody for joining us this evening. I'll speak today about Julius Klinger, a Vienna-born graphic artist who was one of the most influential figures in the development of the modern poster, both as a tool for communication and as an aesthetic object. Vienna, where Klinger was born, was a few hundred miles from the shtetl settlements in Poland, where the wooden synagogues described by Todd were located, a pretty long train ride in those days, and even further, perhaps, in terms of cultural distance. We don't know too much about Julius Klinger's personal life, how he acted, what he thought, but we do know something about the milieu that he came from, the secular, urbane, educated, and assimilated Jews of German-speaking Europe. We know that these people did not share too much culturally with the people who attended the wooden synagogues in Poland. Very often, in fact, Viennese and other Central European urban Jews looked down upon the people of the shtetl and rejected the notion that they even shared an identity with them. But in the end, those distinctions, which may have mattered a lot to Klinger and those like him, did not make much difference to the Nazis. It's not my aim tonight, though, to talk about the end of Klinger's life, and we don't know many of the details about that anyway. Instead, I want to focus on what he achieved. By the way, this is one of the last photographs of Klinger and his wife Emily, taken in 1937. I'm going to start with a disclaimer. My talk today is based on research by someone else, by Jeremy Ainsley, a graphic design historian who teaches at the University of Bristol in the UK. Jeremy was guest curator for an exhibition that the Wolfsonian presented about Julius Klinger in 2017, and author of a companion book for that show. And by the way, you may notice that I'm going to switch back and forth between saying Julius and Julius. I just can't help it. I want to mention that if you didn't get a chance to see the exhibition at the Wolfsonian, it really was a beautiful and compelling exhibition. You have a second chance. It's going to be shown at a new museum in New York City called the Poster House, where it opens on March 4th of this year. So if you're in New York or you have a chance to get up there, and hopefully we'll have a chance to do some traveling by August when it closes, I really recommend that you see that show and the rest of what's on display there. Anyway, Jeremy is one of two real Klinger experts in the English-speaking world. The other is Karen Eitingen, a poster dealer in Montreal who's published a thorough catalog of Klinger's work and who lent several pieces for the exhibition. I'm by no means a Klinger expert myself, but I worked pretty closely with Jeremy on both the exhibition and on the book, so I'm pretty comfortable talking about him. So Julius Klinger was born in Vienna in 1876. By that year, Jews had for several decades enjoyed equal rights with the other citizens of the Habsburg Empire, and they formed an integral part of the vibrant commercial and cultural life of cities like Vienna, Prague, and Budapest. Klinger's own family was part of that commercial world. His father was a successful merchant. In his early years, Klinger developed skills in three key areas that would inform his poster design. In turn, illustration, decoration, and typography. And I do want to mention that the images that I'm going to be showing, except where noted in the caption itself, come from the Wolfsonian's collection. Klinger studied in a vocational high school where he was trained in technical drawing, and he got his start in Vienna doing magazine illustration. He would continue to do illustration work over his whole career, and please note just the beautiful patterning on the dress of the bolero dancer pictured here. Some of his work was fairly pornographic, I should mention. In Vienna, he had studied applied arts with Koloman Moser, a leading figure in the Vienna secession movement. He moved to Berlin in 1897, when he was still quite a young man, and started putting this decorative training to use by publishing guides to ornament In other words, examples of motifs that might be used by professional decorators and draftsmen. Here are a couple plates of portfolios that he published. Finally, after moving to Berlin, he began to work in type design as well. And over his career, he created 3 typefaces, including the one seen here, which was named after him, or which he named after himself, I should say. Poster design was a field where Klinger could apply all 3 of these skills at once. And that's the field where he made his lasting reputation, and which I'll be discussing today. You can see, I think, particularly well in this example, how in his posters he integrated line drawing, patterning, and lettering to create a cohesive and attractive image. He got his start in Berlin working for a printing company called Hollerbaum and Schmidt, which had a stable of graphic designers who worked for the firm, taking commissions to create posters for commercial clients. This is a poster that Klinger designed to advertise the firm by showing caricatures of the well-known designers who worked for it, including himself. He was in Berlin from 1897 until World War I, a time when posters were really coming into their own as a medium for advertising and also winning recognition as an art form and attracting many collectors as well. There are a couple of characteristics of his work from this period that I'd like to point out by showing you a few examples of his posters during the Berlin years. Unlike his peers, he didn't focus too much on product advertising. Instead, many of his posters were for things like theatrical productions, balls, and other kinds of events. So he was very much plugged into the emerging nightlife and popular entertainment scenes that Berlin would become famous for. Another thing I'd like to point out is that there is kind of a through line of playfulness and humor in his work from this period, no matter what he was advertising. In his writing, Klinger would insist that the poster designer had to subordinate his creative expression to the needs of his client. In other words, that he was a hired gun. But it's clear that whether he intended to or not, Klinger expressed something of his own personality in these designs. Having established himself in Berlin, he returned to Austria for reasons that are unknown to me during the First World War. Oops, I'm sorry, I skipped over a couple of the posters from this Berlin period. It was after he moved back to Vienna during the war that he produced the only propaganda poster that he's known for, one promoting Austrian war bonds. You can see here this serpent is a symbol for Britain, Austria's enemy in the war, and each of the 8 arrows represents one of the 8 war bonds that the Austrian government issued during the war. I think this is another way that you can see something of the individual man by looking at his work. Unlike a lot of his contemporaries, Klinger doesn't seem to have been deeply motivated by political concerns or affiliated with any particular party, either right-wing, left-wing, or center. This is, like I said, the only propaganda poster that he designed, although I think it's a pretty striking one. After the war, he settled in Vienna, opened a studio in a fashionable neighborhood, and resumed his practice. In fact, he would spend the rest of his professional life in Vienna. If you look at the selection of posters that he designed once after moving back to Vienna, you can see some contrast with his Berlin work. Most obviously, perhaps, he radically reduced his color palette, working almost exclusively in red, black, and white. And he employed a stripped down, highly geometric visual language which contrasts with the flowing lines that were characteristic of his pre-war Berlin posters. In these ways, Klinger was following the larger international current of modernism that was influencing all of the design fields during the 1920s and 1930s, from architecture to decoration to poster design. But I think you can also see that quality of playfulness and wit continued to be signature qualities of his work, even when sort of there was a very dramatic shift stylistically. During his Vienna years, Klinger created what must have been one of the first ever integrated branding campaigns. His client for this campaign was a cigarette paper company called Taboo. His work for the firm involved not just developing a graphic identity and designing a whole series of posters, but also advertising on the side of trams and painting billboards all over Vienna's buildings. And you can see the really clever way that he kind of integrated the designs for these billboards into the form of the building itself. Another component of Klinger's personality that shines through in his work is what we might call cosmopolitanism. He was clearly open to influences from the rest of the world. You could see that in his embrace of modernist visual culture, in his poster designs. You can also see clear influence, like so many artists, designers, and architects from this time, that he drew from Japanese aesthetics, as in this magazine cover. In fact, this fish motif is one that he came back to in different forms over and over. He also formed professional connections outside of Austria and Germany. He designed 2 posters for the London Underground. And like so many Europeans of that era, he was especially fascinated by the United States, and he very much wanted to experience it for himself. In 1929, we know that he traveled to Detroit. The evidence about this trip is pretty sketchy, but what we do know suggests that he may have been doing some work for General Motors. Nothing seems to have come from this connection, and he didn't stay very long. We know more about a second trip that he made in late 1931, when he visited New York City and stayed for several months into the spring of 1932. While he was there, he taught a class on poster design at the New School, advertising himself as Europe's most prominent poster artist. You can see that claim under his name in the advertising poster here. That was a pretty debatable claim, but he could probably accurately say that he was among Europe's most prominent poster artists. This is kind of a poignant point in the narrative. The New School became famous as an institution that gave safe haven to Jewish refugees after Hitler came to power in Germany. And it's easy to imagine Klinger becoming one of them. But at the time he visited, the Nazis had not yet seized power in Germany, and it would be years before the Anschluss when Austria itself became incorporated into the Third Reich. Besides, Klinger does not seem to have spoken much English, so the temptation to stay in the US might not have been very strong. The story turns very dark, as you can imagine, in the years after he returned to Austria. The last poster he designed, at least that we know of, came at the beginning of 1938. The photo that I showed earlier shows him and his wife Emily in front of a massive poster. You can just get some sense of the scale of it, that he produced in the previous year in 1937. After the annexation of Austria in 1938, the Nazis imposed their racial laws, and it became impossible for Klinger to get commercial work. He apparently made ends meet by teaching. We know almost nothing of his death, besides that he and his wife were deported from Austria in June 1942, along with thousands of other Jews, and put to death a week later in a village near the city of Minsk, in what's now Belarus. As Oren said in his introduction, this is an event about resilience. One thing a cultural institution like the Wolfsonian can offer is a guarantee that the work of someone like Julius Klinger does not get erased. But resilience involves more than preserving cultural heritage. It's also about making sure that it's studied, that it's exposed to the public, and that it remains in cultural circulation. And I'll say that that only happened because, as a visiting scholar, Jeremy Ainsley discovered what we had by Klinger in our collection. He alerted us to its significance, and proposed the project that resulted in this exhibition and the book as well. So much credit goes to Jeremy. And I just want to thank you very much for joining us this evening and giving me a chance to share something of Klinger's work and his story with all of you. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Colette Mello from MBUS. Thank you.
Who's Colette?
Hello, everyone. My name is Colette Mello, the curator and special events manager here at Miami Beach Urban Studios. I'm honored to be part of this important program this evening. And I'm happy to introduce Michael Klotz, who has performed numerous times at Miami Beach Urban Studios. Today, he is going to share a story about his grandmother, who was a Holocaust survivor. And then we will have the pleasure of hearing him play a beautiful viola composition that he had previously recorded for this evening's event. Michael Klotz is an FIU music professor and member of the Amernay String Quartet. He is also the founder of the Vivid Viola Music Festival, and he just started a series of teacher talks with Michael Klotz that you can find on the FIU Miami Beach Urban Studios YouTube channel. Michael, thank you for joining us. I look forward to hearing your story and listening to you perform. I'm handing the baton to you now.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Colette, for the introduction, and it's great to be here tonight with everyone. So I actually wanted to talk about all four of my grandparents were Holocaust survivors. And just a little bit of a disclaimer, the last time I did this was at the Betsy Hotel. I think it was last year, and I was completely overcome with emotion and almost couldn't do it. So I'll try to compose myself as best I can today. But so I just wanted to talk about, yes, so all four of my grandparents survived the Holocaust. In fact, I'm a first generation American because both of my parents were born in Europe, and I'm actually sitting here with my father, who started talking when I had to turn the mute off, so it's okay. But he's quiet now. But anyway, so I'll start with my paternal grandparents. They were from Poland. My grandmother was from Łódź, and she was a part of what's known as the Łódź ghetto. And my grandfather, her name was Helen, or Chaya. And my grandfather, Abraham, was from a small town called Yiskavola, which was near Łódź. And they were eventually both sent to concentration camps. My grandmother was sent to Auschwitz, and my grandfather to Bergen-Belsen, at which point they were liberated. This was in 1944, when they were taken prisoners. They were liberated by the Russians. And actually, well, my grandmother has more of an interesting story in that she was kind of set off on a barge with a whole bunch of prisoners in the concentration camp into the Baltic Sea. And she thought that she was rescued by Danes or Norwegians. And then they settled in Germany right after the war. In like a displaced persons camp that the Germans and Russians actually collaboratively set up, from what I understand. And my dad was born in Bad Werzofen in 1947, which is right outside Munich. They stayed there for about a year, and then they went to Israel, where they lived also just for a year. because my paternal grandfather realized or learned that he had two sisters that had survived the Holocaust that settled in Rochester, New York. And so he joined them with my father and and my grandmother, and they lived there for quite a while. My maternal grandparents were from a region called Zakarpattia, which was in the Ukraine and was sort of on the border of what was then Czechoslovakia and Hungary. And their story is really my grandfather, his name was Asher Zelig, was actually taken into a Hungarian hard labor camp in 1942. They already started. I think it was told to him that this was a way of keeping him safe, but it was certainly not. It was very difficult. And he was, in fact, building the railroad tracks that would eventually, a couple of years later, transport the Hungarian Jews to the concentration camps. So in 1942, he had a family, a wife and 3 children that he was forced to leave behind. And he was liberated in 1944, April of 1944, by the Russians. They came in and they, at that time he was sent back to the Ukraine to build bridges, because I guess, in any case, what's really unique and kind of heartbreaking and beautiful at the same time about their story is that my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, who was a survivor of Auschwitz, was actually the sister of my grandfather's first wife. So when they were liberated, they both returned to their hometown. It was a small town actually called Kushnitze, in the Zakarpattia region, as I had mentioned. And they sort of within a couple of weeks, they both had returned there. And of course, there were no records, there was no proper documentation, but they realized, very unfortunately, at that point, they realized that they had lost, pretty much all of their parents and most of their siblings. Although my grandmother did have one sister who survived. And so upon the, heartbreaking realization that my grandfather's family had perished, his wife and 3 children, they decided to marry the sister of his first wife, which was not, from what I understand, not uncommon, especially amongst the Orthodox Jews. My grandparents were very observant. My maternal grandparents were very, very observant Jews. And so that's how they got together. And then they, both my mother, who unfortunately passed away 10 years ago, and my uncle, who is still living, he lives in Boca Raton, they were born there in the Ukraine, in Kushnitsa. And they lived there. They emigrated to Israel in the early 70s. And then eventually made their way to Rochester as well. Kind of a long story, which I won't get into. But in any case, my parents met in Rochester. And, I would say one thing I'm really grateful. My grandparents, I knew them quite well. I mean, they all, well, my paternal grandfather passed away when I was, I believe, 13, but the other 3 lived long lives, thankfully, and so I knew them even into my young adult life. And I've always felt that it was really quite an honor and a privilege to have to have known them, to be raised by them. They were my daycare. Both sets of grandparents were my daycare when my parents worked. And so as a result, I believe that Yiddish was my first language. I think I learned how to speak Yiddish before I learned how to speak English. And, all of them were, they were not so talkative about their experiences. Occasionally, if we would ask a question, they would tell us. But you know, one thing that I thought was remarkable and just kind of in keeping with some of the issues that we're dealing with today. When I was 18, I was at a music festival in upstate New York called Chautauqua. I don't know if anyone's familiar with it, but I met a young guy who was my age from Germany. He was a young violinist, and we became very good friends. And something happened where his flight back to Germany was changed, and he needed to stay for a couple days. So we brought him back to Rochester with us to stay, and he then flew to New York and back to Germany. But my grandparents, I wanted to see them. I hadn't seen them in a while. These are my maternal grandparents. And I told them that I had a friend with me, and of course I had a little bit of trepidation because he was from Germany, and I truthfully had never really met anyone from Germany before. And they said, bring him over, and I must say that I guess that it was a kind of a lesson in tolerance and forgiveness. I had thought that they would have a problem with the fact that my friend was German, but they did not. They absolutely embraced him. And when I talked to them afterward in Yiddish, they both said, how could we hold your friend accountable? For what happened to us. And, the only person that they held accountable a little bit was Roosevelt, because they had it in their head, I remember. And of course they were half serious. They had it in their head that Roosevelt could have, was told to bomb the railroad tracks and could have possibly prevented their experience. And so maybe if they had a resentment, it was a little bit towards Roosevelt. But no, they were wonderful people, and their story is one that I feel is important for me to tell. And they instilled in me a love of Jewish culture and tradition, and certainly Jewish music. And so then I guess it's probably a good time to go to the piece that I played, that I recorded. The piece is called Tefillah, which means prayer, and it's by Julius Chayes, and Oren talked a little bit about Chayes. The piece is really dear to me for a number of reasons. Well, I think it's a gorgeous work, but my teacher, I studied first at the Eastman School of Music at the University of Rochester. My teacher was a wonderful violinist named Tzvi Zeitlin, who was an Israeli violinist. And I heard him play the piece, actually, once. We played together in a concert while I was a student in a synagogue in Rochester. And I never forgot the opening of the piece is very striking and very powerful. And I always thought about the piece. And then a few years ago, my colleague from the Amernay, Jason Calloway, he belongs to a network of Jewish composers. And one person who contributed to the discussion was a man named Yossi Chayes, who was a professor at the University of Haifa. And so I had Jason investigate. It turns out that Yossi Chayes was the youngest son of Julius Chayes. And he sent Jason a whole bunch of music, including quartets and other stuff. And included in that PDF was this Tefillah. And I was just so overjoyed because I had been thinking about this piece for years and years. And I finally had it, in print in front of me. So since then, I've been playing it as often as possible. I've really played it a number of places. One very special place I played was at Charleston at the Spoleto Festival in the famous KKBE Synagogue. Anyway, thank you again for tuning in and for hearing my story, and I hope you enjoy the Tefillah by Julius Chayes.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to play that right now. Beautiful. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you.
I want to just, before I hand it back to Dr. Stier, I'd like to just mention tomorrow at 4 o'clock, we have a program here by Visages of Memory Photography by Laszlo Suli, and it is a photography of Holocaust survivors in South Florida. So I hope you all will join us for that at 4 o'clock tomorrow via Zoom. So I will hand it back over to Dr. Stier. Thank you.
Thank you, Colette, and thank you to Todd, Jon, and Michael for an amazing collection of presentations that really highlight not only FIU's arts institutions all along the avenue, but also the importance of Jewish culture and memory and resilience. I actually wanted to know, I wanted to ask the three panelists, and I'm gonna start with Jon. The issue of resilience has come up in different ways throughout today's panel, and I'm wondering if you could each say a couple of words about what you think it means to you with respect to the art, the culture, and the material that you deal with, that you presented today, and also just the material that you deal with on a daily basis as part of your work at FIU. We'll start with Jon.
Thank you, Oren. Thanks for putting me on the spot there. I mean, I think it's fundamental to the work that museums do to be in the business of taking the long view and thinking about how these things that often were not valued necessarily very highly in their day, even Klinger's posters, although there were people that collected them, they were commercial posters. They weren't things that were seen as great works of art. But the vision that inspired Mickey Wolfson, and it's not just Mickey Wolfson, but very central to the Wolfsonian's identity, is that these things can be really, profoundly interesting and important, and we can't always know why, but they may well be something that people have an interest and need to see. I mean, I was just working for much of December and January on a grant proposal about essentially ensuring that our kind of storage and conservation, preventative conservation practices are, state of the art, so that the hundreds of thousands of things that we have in our collection can be there for the future. And that has to do with, the heritage of European Jews, but the heritage of many other people and peoples as well.
Thanks so much. Michael, I wanted to ask you the same question, and I'll save Todd for last, but I just wanted to ask you about this issue of resilience in your work and in the music that you play.
Well, thanks. I think, it's really important for me and the quartet, and I think, Oren, we've worked with you before. It's important for us to just disseminate as much of this music as we can, and there are so many composers, many unknown, that perished in the Holocaust, or of course were forced to flee Europe, and it's part of our mission, part of my mission and my quartets to bring those to light, and of course at the same time use it as a platform to educate people about the Holocaust and the terrible tragedies.
Thank you. Todd, I was wondering how you approach this issue of resilience, and I guess also just the issue of preservation, which seems to be another underlying theme.
Yeah, I mean, our museum, was founded in 1995, based off of a traveling exhibit of the Florida Jews, the history of the Florida Jews, because up until that point, your local, community museums might have, a smattering of Jewish materials. But our museum and the exhibit that, started it was basically pulling all, together the history of the Florida Jews, from 1763. And now, we have them in one place. Our collection is still probably small, considering, other museums, of larger sizes. But, like I say, we have a lot of material that, talks about, the ancestors, the Jewish ancestors from Europe and Poland and, South America. And then, like I say, their descendants that have, come to Florida that helped establish a lot of the communities in Florida and help those communities build. And then, like I say, we use our materials, to, explain that history and do our exhibits that talk about various aspects. Like I said, we've had exhibits on the Polish synagogues, we've had exhibits on, sports, on the military, on, food and beverage. So it's, like I say, our main mission is to preserve those artifacts and those stories.
Terrific. Thank you so much. So before we wrap it up, I think I want to just pose another question around to the three of you, related to what you would like to see, what you wish we could do. If we were planning another one of these sessions and you could do just about anything you wanted, based in the three collections that you all work with, and the work that we all do at FIU, as something that we could aspire to, maybe for next year's edition of On the Avenue for Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Week 2022. I'm going to ask Michael first, and then Todd, and we'll close with Jon.
More music. I mean, obviously, I'm very happy to be a part of these things. They're important, and bravo to you, Oren, for all of your work. I just think more of what we're doing, and I would say, God willing, we can be in person, right? I would think by next year. I mean, fingers crossed, right? But I would say this was a wonderful program, and it's nice to showcase the different aspects.
Thank you. Todd, do you have anything on your wish list for a program point or something that you would love for the Jewish Museum?
I mean, I know we have, like I say, we've got, artifacts and materials, related to Poland, and, some materials, on the Holocaust. I mean, we do have, a substantial amount of material related to the St. Louis, which is obviously, keyed in, to Miami Beach, where, we had a shipload of 1,000, refugees that were, eventually turned away and sent back to Europe. So that's an interesting story because, like I say, we've got, stories and photographs from some of the family members that were actually on the ship. And we actually have, memories and, current descendants of, the Jews that were in Miami Beach at the time. So I think that would be an interesting, subject matter.
Terrific, thank you. And Jon, what's on your wish list?
I don't know exactly. Oren, as you know very well, the part of the Wolfsonian's collection that, is most directly connected to the Holocaust in many ways is the significant amount of sort of National Socialist propaganda that we have in our collection. In fact, I spoke about that a few months ago at an on the Avenue event. I don't really want to bring that up in Holocaust Remembrance Week. I don't want that to be what people remember necessarily. I think that there are probably many other examples of artists, designers, architects whose lives were ended or disrupted or impacted in profound ways by the Holocaust in our collection, and I think it would be, you know, really interesting to look some more into that to see how that's manifest in our collection, and also how it's manifest in particular in the United States, in the impact of Jewish refugees in creating, you know, what we think of as modern American culture. And I think you can trace a lot of that in our collection.
Thank you. Yeah, I think also it's worth saying that the presentations today bring up the issue that's often been discussed in certain circles about the nature of Jewish art and Jewish artistic creativity. You know, what is it? How do you define something as Jewish culture? And I think what we learned from today, and what I especially appreciated, Jon, from what you said at the beginning, is the importance of focusing on the creativity in the product itself, and not on the life's end of the creator, because I think we often focus so much on the loss that we lose sight of what we still have, that we have access to even today, and what resonates with us even to today. So I want to thank the audience and the presenters. The Q&A box has been filled with praise for all of your performances, and everyone is very appreciative of them. I want to specifically thank Todd Bothel, Jon Mogul, and Michael Klotz, and of course our co-sponsors, Wolfsonian FIU, Miami Beach Urban Studios, and Jewish Museum of Florida FIU. I'd like to invite everyone to join us at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning for the next event in our series of Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Week. And that's FIU's annual Holocaust Remembrance Ceremony, featuring Holocaust survivor Suli Henkin, with remarks by President Mark Rosenberg. The registration details and information about the entire week's events can be found in the link that I've just posted in the chat, where you can go to get all of the individual registrations for all the remaining events of the week. And so I hope to see many of you tomorrow at 10 a.m. and thank you and goodbye.